Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys. Okay. Jack Rackham video. Has been a while since I watched one of these. I remember it being a great channel. Preemptive like. I hope you guys are doing well. The link to the original video, as always, top of the description. Discord below that makes it easier for me to interact with you, see your recommendations. Up to you. Love to have you. Let's go. The British Empire didn't go quietly. And the thumbnail, Winston Churchill's tainted legacy. So I am well aware that Churchill grew up in a very, very, very upper, like not just an upper class upbringing, but like an extremely upper class. Didn't he grow up in, I forget the name of I think it's a palace. But I know he was a very British, proudly British Empire guy and didn't want to lose that status after World War II. And so I'm sure he did some things that are questionable morally, and I'm assuming that this is what it's about. So, let's get started, shall we? What do I know? I could be completely wrong. Yep.
Crown in the jewel of the India was the crown in the jewel of the British Empire. For 3 centuries, the empire profited enormously from the extraction of cotton, silk, salt, spices, tea, opium, and more. Having control over
Just let me restart, please.
India was the crown in the jewel of the British Empire. For 3 centuries, the empire profited enormously from the extraction of cotton, silk, salt, spices, tea, opium, and more. Having control over just one of these things was enough to make Britain a major player on the world stage. They managed to economically dominate China just through the opium trade, to say nothing of the vast hoards of treasure Britain collected selling all the rest. The people of India were not terribly happy with this arrangement. There were numerous rebellions, all of them crushed. But in the 1900s, they developed a new strategy. Just say no. Boycott, march, protest, don't fight, but don't cooperate. Back in Britain, the public outrage against the atrocities committed in the name of empire had been rising since the start of the century, and economists had been pushing for free international trade for literal hundreds of years. The result? Britain willingly gave up her most prized possession. Where France embroiled itself in decades-long wars in Algeria and Vietnam, the British Empire transitioned with grace to the modern-day Commonwealth. At least, that's the image I had in my head. India's independence was, in fact, marred with many tragedies over several decades, but it was still an exceptional success story. Other colonies were not so fortunate. The British Empire did not go quietly. This video is sponsored by Armchair History TV. Yeah, you know the YouTuber Armchair Historian?
Right.
He's a TV now. AHTV is a second home to your favorite history YouTubers. Oh, there they go now. Look at them go. Hey, look, it's me! I have not one, but 2...
There are some Invicta, Potential History, Mr. Beat, I love him. Jack Rackham obviously has history with Hilbert.
special episodes on this
Oh
platform.
my god, it's been so long since I reacted to a lot of history stuff, and it's bringing back a lot.
Did you know that in World War II, the Italian head of state was not Mussolini? Italy still had a king. His name was Victor Emmanuel III. He spent his reign becoming one of the most prolific coin collectors of all time. Collaborating with fascists really freed up his schedule. Or how about that time the Catholic Church became that most unique of structures, a pornocracy? Oh, that's a spicy headline. No wonder you're not on YouTube. It's ad-free and uncensored. I love that history creators have a space like this, and I would love to see it take off. And if you're last-minute Christmas shopping, this present doesn't have to ship. Just saying. Use code JackRackham to get 50% off your first month using the link on screen or in the description.
Guys, if this interests you and you learned it from it here, please make sure to use their promo codes, the original link to the video, top of the description. It's really important you give them credit where you saw it. So please do that.
The dissolution of the British Empire is actually a story of subterfuge and tremendous violence. It's a lot of different stories happening all over the world all at once with centuries of context, so for my own convenience, I'm going to commit a cardinal sin and oversimplify all of this through the lens of one of the imperialists who watched over it all. A man beloved by many as a national hero and seen by many others as the embodiment of of imperialism's sins. Please welcome Mr. Winston Churchill. Churchill came of age at the empire's peak and was an imperialist through and through. He served in the Boer War under a man named Kitchener, the very same Kitchener who appeared as the villain of one of my other videos, and the same Kitchener who helped make concentration camps start trending. This, incidentally, was the war that started anti-imperialist sentiment in the UK, but it was still small. Churchill comes back from the war and gets into politics. He is extremely young, but has the opinions of someone thrice his age. Tell me, Mr. Churchill, why have you decided to run for the Conservative Party?
Don't they have like baby pictures of Winston Churchill? Why did they pick like a early adulthood onto a baby?
Someone thrice his age. Tell me, Mr. Churchill, why have you decided to run for the Conservative Party here in Oldham? Well, you see, I just can't get behind the idea of the Irish governing themselves. It doesn't make any sense to me. And women, too. People are saying they ought to have a voice in government these days. It's all a bit silly. But other than that, I'm really a liberal in all but name. And do you? And then, of course, there's the matter of the less civilized races. Of course, I believe in equal rights of all men, regardless of color, which is why we have a real duty to colonize them, so they don't hurt themselves.
Why, that's Jesus Christ.
Certainly. Terribly sorry. I have some organized labor to break apart. I must be on my way. It's been said of Churchill that he sure was lucky to have found in Hitler one of the few men more villainous than himself. Now, that's not entirely a fair description. At the same time he was breaking up strikes, he was fighting for a minimum wage. He came around on Ireland eventually, introduced prison reform, broke up monopolies. He opposed Kitchener's handling of the Boer War, but
so Churchill is clearly a classic British Empire's man living in an age of a declining British Empire towards, interwar years into the World War II, end of World War II, and into the 1950s. So
suffice to say, broke up monopolies. He opposed Kitchener's handling of the Boer War, but suffice to say, he was old-fashioned, even for the 1910s. Now, he held some higher posts in government. The First World War came and went, and a handful of colonies gained various degrees of independence, but there was, obviously, a much bigger crisis coming up. Hitler comes to power in Germany, and he is, lucky for Churchill, leagues more despicable. I've spent 7 years researching every nook and cranny of history for this channel, including a lot of villains from all corners of the earth, and remarkably, Hitler continues to stand out as an Everest of unpleasantness. The British, unfortunately, were reluctant to take action. For one thing, they were afraid of another experience as richly awful as the First World War, and for another, well, this Hitler's kind of got a point. About how Germany was treated after World War I, obviously. I know. I was one of the only people telling you to be more lenient. But look what's happening in Europe. This man is literally Hitler. Hitler finally takes things too far and invades a country that Britain is obliged to protect. So the British declare war, and then continue to do, nothing for 8 months. I never realized this, but until Germany took over France, people in England were literally calling World War II the Boer War and the Sitzkrieg, because
I thought they were calling it the Phony War, or is that World War?
Nothing was happening. Britain and France mostly spent their time building up defenses, but that means Prime Minister Chamberlain had declared war on Germany and then sat while Germany finished its business in Poland. Parliament kicked Chamberlain out of office and, without too much initial enthusiasm, settled on Churchill as his replacement. France fell to the Germans, and Hitler turned his attention to bombing London. Things looked pretty bleak, but Churchill was optimistic. As you can see, our industrial output is continuing to rise in spite of the Blitz, and Hitler's opportunities for invasion are increasingly slim. But, on the contrary, so are our opportunities for an unconditional victory. Unless Churchill had been in communication with US President FDR even before becoming Prime Minister, and continued to impress upon him the importance of Hitler not winning the war. FDR was seemingly convinced, and although the US public and Congress wouldn't permit him to join the war, he went as far as not fighting, but giving Britain all the weapons she'd ever need for the truly modest price of a few bases in the Caribbean that really just freed up more personnel to fight in the war. But there was another...
Is it like getting rid of a lot of colonial holdings, especially in the Pacific?
Much subtler cost. The UK and the USA, although alike in many ways, were, in a few ways, strange bedfellows. Not because of the whole 1776 thing, but because of how they saw the world. Britain envisioned a world still run by empires, with its own at the top. They had preferential tariffs encouraging their colonies to be economically interdependent with the rest of the empire, whereas the USA stood to benefit greatly if all of those colonies suddenly became independent. The USA was a democracy, and the British Empire was also a democracy for about 10 to 20% of its population. Otherwise, it was an empire that conquered a lot of different people and enforced its will on them through military force. Kind of like what Japan was hoping to accomplish in the Pacific. Britain actually debated in the 1920s which rising naval power to align itself with, Japan or the United States. Obviously, it had a lot of reasons to pick the United States, but...
Money and swagger for the pros. They're cool. Thanks. Boats are nice. English BFFs, true. Cons, kinda awkward. Former colony hates colonies. Okay.
This misalignment between the two allies is important. Britain and America needed to be on the same page about the war, so they drew up an agreement called the Atlantic Charter. This was the document on which their cooperation hinged, on which all the allies' cooperation hinged. It was Stalin violating these terms that was the first spark of the Cold War. Now, the allies didn't want to be seen as opportunistic aggressors, so they wrote that they wished for, quote, no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned, and that they, quote, respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been
unless they're communists. Sorry. Yes, choose what you like, as long as it's what we want.
To see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them, unquote. This was intended to apply to all of the areas occupied by the Axis, but Churchill had effectively signed off on anti-imperialism. I didn't think you had it in you, imperialist scum! Well, of course, I didn't mean all people. Obviously, we're not including Africans, Asians, or Arabs. As a matter of fact, I was hoping you and I could make an arrangement over who controls the Balkans. Try though Churchill might to change the definition of all people, the colonized people of Africa and Asia would beg to differ. World War II would in some ways be a Pyrrhic victory for Britain. Sort of like the elves at the end of Lord of the Rings. They stopped a great evil from
Jesus Christ.
taking over the world, but the power that had held them up for so many centuries was waning, and everyone around the world knew it. Only months after the war was over, Indonesia revolted against the Dutch, Vietnam against the French. A very curious thing happened in Britain, though. 2 months after winning the largest war in history, Churchill was voted out of office, which is weird given how wildly popular he was, still to this day, regardless.
I watched a video on this. 999 million views. That when Britain started the war, that the two different governments at the time, or two different parties, major parties at the time, where Churchill's party would take care of the war effort abroad, and then the other party would take care of the home front. And it seemed that the home front party, the party taking care of the Britain at the time, did a really good job, and so they sympathized more with him. Damn, I can't talk well.
regarded by many as one of the best prime ministers. But his party, the Tories, lost their majority in parliament, and suddenly he was just another MP. It just so happens that the leader of the Labour Party, who was promising domestic reform in the UK and won the election, was not so much an imperialist, and India was cut loose. But it was a small window. Churchill was back in 10 Downing by 1951, and he was not happy to see India gone. Churchill was a pragmatist who came around on home rule when necessary. He could adapt the empire if need be, but he refused to abandon it. As a result, his second tenure as prime minister was a lot less heroic.
This is a great video.
Kenya, less than a decade after exposing the true horrors of the Nazi regime, the British response to the country's independence movement was to force hundreds of thousands of civilians into concentration camps. Not death camps, mind you, no gas chambers, just good old-fashioned British concentration camps. The same was true in Malaysia, except there, unlike Kenya, prisoners weren't even forced into hard labor or regularly violated. The people actually fighting the war in Malaysia did have to deal with Agent Orange before getting their heads cut off, so it was a trade-off. Kind of makes the British look a whole lot better in Iran, where the country wasn't colonized, so all they could do was own all of the oil fields, refuse to prove they were paying Iran the right percent of revenue, then embargo the country and stage a coup. And the disheartening thing is, I hesitate to call this policy successful, but war crimes did give Churchill the results he wanted. By the time he left 10 Downing Street in 1955 on account of his health, Kenya and Malaya were still subject to the empire. But each of those conflicts came with costs that ultimately weren't sustainable.
It seems like the kind of human, the kind of ways that you gain power in the world stage have sort of stayed the same, the objective, but it seems like over time, countries have had to hide more and more and not be openly exploiting places like they could have been in the past for seemingly all of human history before mid 1900s. So I think like we are still the same humans that, you know, we want our country to be on top at whatever cost, but you have to play a different game nowadays, it seems.
France was mired in wars and
what do they call that, neo-colonialism or something? Or
with costs that ultimately weren't sustainable. France was mired in wars in Algeria and Vietnam that ultimately collapsed the Fourth Republic, and Britain under Churchill appeared to be headed down the same road. So, I want to wrap up with what I consider the Empire's swan song before decolonization really came out in force. It's an event that would have had Churchill rolling in his grave if it weren't for the fact that he was still a member of Parliament at 88 years old when it went down. A few years after Churchill stepped down as Prime Minister, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which at the time was being operated by Britain and France. Not only was it an enormous economic asset in its own right, it was crucial to connecting what was left of their empires. Luckily, Egypt went to war with Israel around the same time, and the area around the Suez Canal, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the world for global trade, was contested. So Britain and France had no choice but to intervene.
That's what I'm talking about, right there. It's like, that's a great example of what I meant, is that way back in the day, it used to be, you know, okay, we need this area. We're just going to go in as British troops or French, whatever, and take it. But now you have to be a little more sneaky. And so this happens. That's kind of what I meant.
So Britain and France had no choice but to intervene.
Let me know if I'm wrong,
jump
obviously.
into the middle of the war, guns blazing, saying, "Now hold up! All this fighting around the canal is disrupting international peace and stability.
I guess
we are bringing the canal back to our neutral protection. So everybody back up! The Prime Minister demands you retreat 10 miles away from the canal, whether you're Egyptian or Israeli." We're Egyptian. What? Yeah, we're all Egyptian. There hasn't been any fighting here yet. The Israeli army is still in Sinai. No, that can't be right. They told us they would be here today. Oh, what? It quickly came to light that France and...
Oh God, humans are funny, huh?
Britain had
We're still the same bastards that lived in the 1800s, okay? We just play by different rules. That's one of the funniest things I've come to realize learning about history and stuff. It's like we're the same people that were like pillaging places. And now it's like, oh, no choice. We have to intervene.
actually called... What? It quickly came to light that France and Britain had actually called up the Israeli government and talked them into declaring war on Egypt explicitly so the imperial powers could have an excuse to take back the canal. This managed to upset everyone. The Soviet Union was threatening to intervene, and the American president threatened to kick France and Britain out of NATO and crash the British pound. When Dwight D. Eisenhower is chewing you out for intervening in another country's affairs, and communist Russia agrees with him, you done goofed. It turned out some of Churchill's fears from World War II had been realized. The USA had the power to diplomatically and economically devastate the UK. They were still friends, but it was hard for Britain to do anything without America's tacit approval. And America was not so big on colonialism. Through waning political power, rising costs, and increasing outrage at home, the old world order was going kaput. Churchill, from his Chartwell country home, was watching the sun set on the British Empire.
It's such a great video. How the turntables turn. Tables turn. That was fantastic. Very interesting. If I said anything wrong or just flat out, I would love to see your guys' comments. Regardless, I'd love to see your guys' comments. Any answers to the questions I had or whatever. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would love if you liked and subscribed. And hopefully I will see you next time. Bye, guys.